Our story begins with Charles Constable, a police officer from another world. After pursuing and confronting a goblin in the misty streets of London, Charles was quickly knocked unconscious and dragged into a bright light, eventually coming to in the storeroom of the most popular tavern in Waterdeep, the Yawning Portal. A very confusing few days followed, but thanks to the support of the owner of the tavern, Durnan, and his family, he was sent on his way along with some gold and Durnan's hand-me-down braces of defense from his adventuring days. Charles set out to discover the city that he had found himself in, but his new friends assured him he would always be welcomed warmly in the Yawning Portal if he was to ever return. Meanwhile, across the city stood the grand and Sword Coast-renowned Waterdavian Museum of Archaeology. The museum was always bustling with students from various schools and colleges across the land, as it was one of the largest and by far the most diverse collection of artifacts from the four corners of Faerun. Working alongside the museum's curators was a half-elf by the name of Sydney Thatch, one of the lecturers from the university in Waterdeep. Anytime something new was donated to the museum, she would be the one who was brought in to fact-check the notes that had been made on the artifact before intently studying and learning from it. Sydney had taken part in several archaeological expeditions in her younger years, one of which she found herself crossing a long, sandy beach on the way back to port. As she crossed the luscious sands, she tripped on something protruding from the ground below her. A hand, made of metal. She dropped to her knees, instantly digging around the hand to find an arm, then a shoulder, head, torso, and then with one final tug, she pulled the mechanical humanoid from the sand, landing next to her with a thud. Without a second to think, she cast an identify spell, learning that the creature was known as a Warforged. As the sun set, she had made camp on the land above the sands, with the tide now fully ashore. The Warforged sat silently across the campfire from her, the lights of the flames flickering upon his shiny exterior. She watched in anticipation. Dirty, oil-covered hand rested against her cheek, hoping her hours of hard work restoring the being would pay off. Her eyes began to shut as the embers of the fire slowly extinguished. In the dead of night, she awoke with a jolt to see two bright blue circles staring back at her. With a rusted, crackling voice, the mechanical man spoke in a demanding but confused manner. Sydney quickly but calmly explained to him who she was and the state she had found him in. As she spoke, the memories of what had happened came flooding back to him. His life in the circus, the attack on his friends, and falling over the edge of the cliff, plunging to the deepest depths of the sea. And then suddenly, a voice, as if echoing around him, the voice of the being that had rescued him from the abyss spoke, reminding him that it was he who allowed him a second chance, an opportunity to seek out his friends, an opportunity to destroy those who had wronged him. Shaking back to reality, Booster introduced himself, and he was eternally grateful for Sydney's help. After getting to know each other, they quickly realized they could help one another. Sydney could help him to find his family, and Booster helped many secrets of the Warforged that were almost universally unknown, all of which would be incredibly useful for Sydney's research. From that day forward, whenever an expedition was taking place, both Sydney and Booster would go together, and it wasn't long before the two became inseparable. Many years passed and the days of their expeditions were behind them, leaving both of them to take positions at the university, while still working closely as experts at the museum. But although their adventurous lifestyle had faded, Booster always kept his ear close to the ground, hoping for any sign of his family. Both Sydney and Booster had been working several days straight at the museum, sifting through various items that had been donated after a recent raid of an ancient and forgotten civilization. Sydney had noticed in her time during the opening hours each day, a man had been spending a considerable amount of time intently staring at the Unknown World exhibit, filled with a plethora of items, the origin of which had never been understood. She decided one day to introduce herself to the man and ask him about his unusual fixation on these artifacts. He politely nodded before introducing himself as Officer Charles Constable. He asked a simple question that Sydney quickly answered.
How did these get here?
She tried to explain to him that these items featured in the exhibit had no origin that they could trace, nor were recognized by anyone across the land. He laughed a little, shaking his head, as he pulled a small coin purse from his pocket and emptied it into his palm. He offered his hand to her, raising the coins to the light. Sydney studied a single shiny sixpence with wonder in her eyes before Charles spoke.
I wonder if you could help me,
he said with sadness in his voice, like a lost child. Sydney and Booster sat for days on end hearing tales of the world Charles had come from, bewildered that it wasn't fiction. Charles explained that the items held within their exhibit were all from his world, and by finding how they got to Faerun, may lead him home. Baffled by his pure existence, Sydney offered to take Charles in and allow him to use the university's resources to try and find anything that could lead him in the right direction. Months passed and there was very little sign of any development for Charles, now Charlie. He spent day after day reading and asking around to no avail, and slowly losing hope at ever seeing his beloved city again. Late one night, he'd planned to thank Sydney for her help and head out into the world the next morning to try and find his place in Faerun. As he arrived at her office, he found her speaking to a tall, powerful-looking paladin wearing gleaming white and golden armor and a long red velveteen cape. Judith Helmsdottir pleasantly introduced herself to the room and began to explain her business. She told them of the emblem of the Order of the Radiant Heart, which had been taken from their temple that day, and she was led to believe that an anti-religious group of thieves called the Outriders were behind the robbery. She expressed the monetary value of the emblem and imagined that would be why they would take such a beloved artifact. Judith continued by explaining that she'd heard many stories of the adventures of Sydney and Booster, knowing full well they only hunted treasure for the preservation of the artifacts rather than the fame and fortune that came with stealing them. She knew they would be the perfect team to help her retrieve it. Although Sydney initially informed her that their days of expeditions had long passed, Judith politely insisted that the item's return was crucial to the continuation of their prayers and devotions. Sydney suddenly felt the swell of adventure within her chest, and without another second of thought, she agreed to help her. At that moment, Booster noticed Charlie stood by the door, listening in with a smile of excitement.
Hey, fancy coming with us? You've got the muscle. Could be useful fighting off these Outriders,
Booster said with a robotic but somehow endearing grin. Charlie, caught up in the excitement of the room, quickly agreed as he was welcomed in by people he already felt as though he'd known for a lifetime. After successfully taking care of the Outriders and returning the emblem to the Order, Judith addressed the team, expressing the sincerity of her gratitude. For Sydney and Booster, returning this artifact was just another day, but their adventure had deeply resonated with Judith. She told them that the work they were doing, going out of their way and putting themselves into danger just to preserve these items they had no prior connection to, was commendable. Before leaving to return to the Order, Judith assured them that if they ever wanted her help on an expedition, she would be more than happy to accompany them. From that day forward, their team was formed, and it wasn't long before they became world-renowned explorers and treasure hunters, highly respected within the university, as well as amongst the people of Faerun. Their team began to grow over the year they travelled together, most notably of which was Captain of the Legless, Joanna Hadsworth, a fiery, eccentric airship pilot from Cormyr. She and her team of lovable and usually drunken misfits travelled the world, all in the name of discovery. She became closely acquainted with the treasure trackers after they had crossed paths chasing the clues for the same relic, the Book of Exalted Deeds. Joanna and her team heard through the grapevine that the book was filled with visions of true virtue and guidance for defeating evil. Although Joanna put on a front to her crew that she would take the book and sell it to the highest bidder, she knew that the secrets it held may be crucial in helping to save her brothers and father from the veil of evil they had been shrouded in many years ago. The two teams butted heads at first after a conflict of interest, but it soon became apparent that they could solve their problems together as long as the book ended up in the Waterdavian Museum. On their adventures that followed, Charlie and Joanna became close. She was an outcast and so was he. They found solace in each other's company, and although she loved him, Joanna was in the peak of her career and showed no signs of stopping. Charlie understood. Sydney and Booster returned to the museum to study the book. Judith found what was important to her in tracking down those who had been wronged by the Knights of the Order long ago, hoping to restore the reputation of the Radiant Heart. Officer Charlie set out on the Legless with Joanna and her crew to discover the wondrous and constantly surprising world he had found himself in only a year ago. Sydney received word one day, long after the group had separated, of a shrine. A long-lost shrine. The exact kind they would chase when they were all together. She felt a feeling she hadn't felt in some time, the swell of adventure building within her chest. Booster was more than ready to get out to the museum and spend some time in the field again with his closest friends, and so the two planned the expedition meticulously. Judith arrived soon after, bags packed and filled with adventurous spirit just as before. Then, after a wonderful night of sharing stories of their time apart, they were ready to go. Morning broke. The hazy light shone across Sydney's face as she laid in bed, beaming from ear to ear. At that moment, a distinct hum began to echo across Waterdeep. Wrapping herself in her dressing gown, she hurried to the balcony to see the Legless approaching gracefully on the horizon. Booster, Judith, and Sydney quickly grabbed their equipment and hurried to the museum's garden to board the ship. Charlie, happier than ever, stepped down from the Legless to greet his friends he'd missed so much. Joanna haphazardly slid down a guide rope before giving Sydney the biggest hug as her crew helped the others take their bag aboard. Sydney, in awe of the airship as she always was, led Joanna back on board.
Where are we off to then, boss?
Joanna excitedly inquired, following behind her. Sydney smiled warmly, recognizing Joanna's excitement as her own from her younger years. Sydney struggled to speak, almost overwhelmed by her own excitement.
Captain, set a course for Rex Doula's Parter.
The Legless's signature horn blared. The engines roared and they took to the sky. What worlds waited them on the horizon? What treasures could they find? Let's find out together. Tales from the Yawning Portal. The Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan. Hi guys, this is Rob. I just want to say a real big thank you straight up the top for everyone who provided some voice acting lines there for me. We got Harry Fleming, George Atwill, Izzy Weaver, and Alice Burford. So, that was the pretale to our next Dungeons & Dragons game, the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan. I thought I'd do a little bit of a project and write something about it beforehand, and it turned into whatever this was. So, if you liked it, please let me know. Any feedback is good feedback, and I want to know if I was to make these in the future, if one, people would listen, and two, I'm actually doing it in the right way. I'll see you around. Thanks for watching. And listening. Mostly listening. It's only audio. Bye!